most other listeners, the HubSpot form listener includes a feature called custom data layer values. This allows you to utilize event activity and specific variables to write rules that push custom values into your data layer. The first step to using this feature is to define actual variables at the global settings level, which are then available across all of your listeners to write specific rules for. You can see here we have form name, form category, and user score as specific variables that we'll be using in this example. Now, I'm going to walk through a high-level overview of creating a couple rules, but if you'd like a more in-depth review of how rules can be created, check out the video right here. So let's dive into what we call a lookup rule. Now, a lookup rule allows you to define conditions, and when those conditions are met, to push specific values into the data layer in variables that you choose. Now, when you're configuring a lookup table, you're going to name that table and provide a description. And in this case, for my conditions, I want this to apply regardless of the HubSpot event. And so I'm actually going to leave events empty, and I'm only going to match a single item here, which is the form ID. Now, this form ID is a value that you can actually get directly from HubSpot, which I will show you in a moment. In this case, if those conditions are met, I would like to push values into the form category and the form name variables. So here we are taking a look at HubSpot directly. And if I edit a form, what I'm going to see up in the URL here is the actual form identifier, or the form ID. When your forms load on your website, this form ID is the unique identifier that lets the system know that this is the form that's actually loading. So in this case, I'm using form identifiers from multiple forms, and I'm writing a simple rule that says if the form ID contains this value, then push these two values into these data layer variables. Now, it's important to note that these rules are read from top to bottom. And once a match is found, then it stops looking for a match. So as a result of that, I have what's called a wildcard at the bottom down here. And so if a form loads on a page and it does not have an identifier that matches any of these four values, then it's actually going to use this regular expression here. And this is going to be the rule that's matched. So you can see what's occurring here is that when these individual forms load, we're going to get these values in our data layer. And this is pretty powerful because you can then take these values and you can push them into a tool like Google Tag Manager in order to categorize conversions or user activity on the website. So let's take a look. We have a website here that's actually loading 4 different HubSpot forms. And no matter what the activity is, whether it's the HS form loaded or an actual form validation error or a submission, what we're going to see is that we have our form identifier being automatically collected from the listener. And now because of our rules, we actually start to see some custom values being pushed into our data layer that we can capture. So let's go ahead and look at a form validation error. And you can see the identifier here. We would expect this to return value newsletter and form name for. So we can go down here and see that we have form category as newsletter, form name is for. So that's just a rather simple example of how a lookup table can be used to create some powerful rules. Let's look at a simple rule here. Now, in this rule, we have a simple condition. Every time a form is submitted, we want to add 10 into this value called user score change. And what we would use this variable for is to effectively incrementally increase a user's overall activity score on a website if we want to, for example, collect a total or universal score for that user in our analytics platform. So let's go ahead and submit a form. We can see we submitted this form, and we have an event here called HS form submitted. Now, down in our custom values, not only do we see the values from our lookup table, but we also see now the incremental value of 10 being added into our user score. There's a lot of different use cases for custom rules. Just walked you through a couple fairly basic ones. One other important thing to note is that, as I mentioned, rules are read from top to bottom, and that applies inside of lookup tables as well as between individual rules. And so if you would like this simple rule to apply prior to the lookup table, you can simply drag and drop that. And again, what will happen is once a value is found for a variable because it matches a rule, then it will stop looking and it will not proceed to the next rule.